You're listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by independent Manitoba Senator Marilou McPhedran, who has introduced legislation to lower Canada's voting age to 16. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so I want to get into this topic because, as we were doing our little pre-chat, I was talking about how this has been something I've been interested in since I was this age, which is giving voting rights in Canada to 16 and 17-year-olds. We know that the earlier you vote, the more likely you are to become a lifelong voter. We know that teenagers are plenty able to be informed and civically engaged, even if they don't have the right to vote yet. You've introduced legislation in the Senate on this topic. Why should Canada make this change, and why do you think it's so important that we do?
Well, I think one of the key facts that we need to bear in mind that in the 2016 census in Canada, we officially became an old country. We have more old people in this country than young people. And the burdens that we in my generation and generations ahead of me and after me are going to leave behind have tremendous impact on the voters and the should-be voters in our country. The other thing I want to note is that I've had really good responses from teachers about this, and no one knows their students better than teachers in a high school setting. And I've come across many teachers in many different parts of Canada and had some really positive conversations also with the Canadian Federation of Teachers, because they're teaching civics for the most part at exactly the age that helps young people be very well informed and to be able to make choices.
So you've been working on this issue for a while. This is actually, I think, the second time you've introduced this legislation.
No, more.
More.
Yes, I've been a senator for 9 years, and every session, every new parliament, I introduce the expansion of voting rights to include 16 and 17-year-olds.
Right. So I'm wondering, over that time, since it's nearly a decade, have you seen a change in the level of interest from young people? I'm just wondering in my own experience, when I was that age, there was the talk of the war in Iraq starting. And that was a real flashpoint for people of my age, because we didn't think that Canada should go to that. Ultimately, Jean Chrétien, the prime minister at the time, decided that we wouldn't go into that war. But it was a big flashpoint for people of my age group, given just everything that's going on in the world right now and the constant barrage of news coming at people. Have you seen more interest in young people in civically minded issues? And is this something that maybe will help push us towards getting, them actually getting the vote?
I think so. And I would recommend that anyone who has an interest in this idea of revitalizing our democracy by expanding our voting rights to 16 and 17-year-olds, take a look at Vote 16 or Vote Says, it's the same in French and English, .ca. That's a website that I have participated in extensively. It is now a freestanding website because we have a national campaign going. My bill is the legislative arm of a much broader campaign that is happening with many, many young people at the high school age in their high schools active.
So you mentioned, some of the other efforts that are going on. I just saw on, I think it was Twitter the other day, that there's now a petition in the House as well on this. And I think MPP Erskine Smith co-signed on that. So there's clearly some momentum there. Given you've introduced your bill a few times, are we moving towards more momentum or less momentum, or is this the usual amount of momentum? Where are we in the engagement process here?
Really interesting question, Teresa. I think we need to bear in mind that we had in this last election, which is just, barely, not even 3 months ago, 100 new members of parliament elected. So there's a lot we don't know about these folks. I will say that the voting trend, and one of the best measurements of this is actually a colleague on the House side who from the NDP has a formal policy supporting this expansion of voting rights to 16 and 17-year-olds. And a former member of Parliament, Taylor Bachrach, was very lucky to get a good place in the lottery, which, as you know, is the only way that a private member's bill can be introduced. And he chose to do it on expanding voting rights to 16 and 17-year-olds. And it didn't make it to second reading. None of the bills that have actually gone in through on the House side have ever made it to second reading. One of my earlier bills did make it to second reading in the Senate, and then there was prorogation. So I start over again each time. But just to go back to for a moment to that bill, because we're talking less than 2 years ago. And what happened there was that, yes, the government, for the most part, voted against it, but 20 members of the government voted in support of it, including, of course, the wonderful Nate Erskine-Smith. And it was a substantial increase in the vote among members of Parliament. So now we have 100 new members. We don't know what it is that they may think, but we have to get out, and that's one of the reasons for the petition. One of the things that we do through the Vote 16 or Vote Says campaign is we look at all the different ways that we can A, raise awareness, B, increase the knowledge level. Because when this idea was first introduced more than 20 years ago with a bill, there was really no research. But in 2007, Austria lowered their voting age at all election levels in the country to 16. And they started to research right away. And many of the, no, I shouldn't say many, but several of the key researchers that we now turn to who have published credible, carefully prepared research actually come out of pro-voting movements, so they understand the need for really solid evidence. And increasingly what we're getting is evidence research that dispels the major stereotypes that have been relied on, and in the Senate are still being relied on by senators that oppose this expansion of rights. And this is an indicator for us that this is another opportunity for us to raise the level of genuine knowledge about this issue, because the more you understand the values, the benefits, the more it becomes a key factor in revitalizing our democracy at a time when democracy is under threat all over the world.
So you actually sort of started going into the direction of my next question, which was to talk about other jurisdictions. So you mentioned Austria. Scotland is another place where we've been tinkering with this. Are there other places that you can maybe mention and what's been learned there so far? And then importantly, people who are youth voting activists, what can they learn from these examples?
Well, I will respond on Scotland with, I think, a really interesting anecdote. It's something that I love to share with my Conservative colleagues, who for the most part, although a couple of them have told me privately that they do think it's a good idea, but they still follow a pretty strict caucus way of proceeding in session. But in Scotland, the Conservatives predictably opposed expanding the right to vote to 16 and 17-year-olds in the referendum. However, as you know, exit research is done, and the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party officially changed her position. The party changed its position once it saw the research. Once they realized that, in fact, young people vote across the spectrum. And the prediction, their prediction that they would all tilt left was not borne out by the research at all. So one of my, I guess as an academic, one of my great interests is to do whatever I can to raise the level of knowledge about this, because where you have politicians actually looking at the evidence, you can see that there are shifting positions, and you can see a movement towards legislation. I do want to come back to Canada, though, on this point about how young people vote and how it's a wrong stereotype that they all vote one way or the other. And that is to look at what we just did in the April 28th election in this country, where, as I'm sure you know, elections are run in high schools across this country. And this year, we had over 800,000 students voting in this country. And guess what? Guess who they
They
voted in the
elected a
majority?
conservative minority. Yep.
They elected a conservative minority. That's right. So I
Yep.
say to my conservative colleagues, and I use that both with a capital C and a small c, who are relying on these stereotypes, please look at the evidence here. This is a win-win for our democracy.
It's really interesting you bring that up, because this is always the contention when you try and change the system. It has to be, we saw this with electoral reform too, and all the debates that centered around that. The problem with letting political parties make these decisions is they want to bias it towards themselves, of course. And any good system will be fair across the board. So I think it's a really good point that you bring up. Not only did the young voters in high schools elect a conservative minority federally, they also elected a conservative minority in Ontario in our recent election that was happening at the same time. So, it really does knock down this very long held belief that people vote towards the left of the spectrum when they're young, and then they become more conservative with time. This is not borne out by data at all. So, if you're conservative out there, think about this idea. It's a great idea. I want to talk about, other detractors, maybe not from a partisan lens, but people who have other critiques about this idea. One of them, obviously, is that young people are too immature, even though we allow them to drive cars at this point. Another is that they're too influenced by parents. Can you respond to those types of criticisms? And I'm also interested, in your background as a women's rights activist, because a lot of these arguments were made against women voting as well.
Identical arguments. In one of my first speeches introducing the bill to expand voting rights, I actually noted this very point, that the arguments are word for word against young people, 16 and 17-year-olds, as they were against women. And so really this comes down to an expansion of rights. And those who are privileged and have those rights not wanting to share those rights. And it's a very emotional reaction that has to be tempered by the evidence. I think it's really helpful to look at some of the research that actually has been done on the brain and what it is that is used in the brain when somebody makes a decision such as choosing someone in a voting booth. And that research identifies what's called soft and hot cognition. And the part of the brain that we use when we go into a voting booth, when we make that decision, is cold cognition. And that is developed by the age of 16 in the brain. That is more than capable and functioning at an optimal level at the age of 16. Arguably, for a lot of our much older voters, we might have a concern about that. But we never take away their right to vote. And the way in which the psychological research underscores the sociological research is to really point out that the capacity is there, and it's really up to us as pro-democracy to change that opportunity, to expand the rights. And as a way of doing that, this bill is a demonstration of how easy it would be. This is of constitutional proportions. That's true. Expanding rights have a very strong constitutional character. But we can expand voting rights by a statute. It does not require any kind of a constitutional amendment. So we know that young people have the capability. We know that many, many young people, certainly of those that I've interacted with, and I've been in high schools across this country. One of the interesting things about the period when we were locked down with COVID was that I spent a lot of time online in high school classes across this country. And I was really lucky to be able to work with an Edmonton-based group, a Global Center for Education, and we ran a project, they ran it, in 5 different high schools in 5 different parts of Canada with the high school students themselves. And the level of research that they did, the level of thought that they brought to the process, and the way in which their teachers respectfully worked with them, I could just see how that would play out if they were actually able to vote. I would argue that at that stage in young people's lives, they are at one of their most physically stable times. That when you're 18, 19, typically that's when your life is upended. It may be in a good way, but still you're often moving. You're often leaving your stable situation. For most people, it's a high school family situation, not for all. And so this is in many ways an ideal time for Canadians to begin the process of voting. What the research also tells us, Teresa, is vote young, vote long.
This is something I've read about a lot in all of my nerdy reading about voting ages and things like this, is that the statistics, maybe they've changed since I've last looked at them, but if you vote consistently in the first 3 elections you're likely to become a lifelong voter at that point. Is that true?
That's our understanding as well.
Yeah.
And that also applies to the research that's been done, particularly in Austria, with the degree of retention of 16 and 17-year-old voters into the rest of their lives, because we have a real advantage here, and that is for more than 18 years, research has been conducted. We have actual evidence, not just stereotypical assumptions that we can rely on in what actually happens, A, when you lower the voting age to 16 and 17, but what that expansion of voting rights does to engagement in democracy. And that goes beyond voting, because some of the research indicates that there's a greater engagement in those around you, your space, your knowledge level, and that contributes in other positive ways to families and to communities.
I want to talk about the fact that this isn't the first time this conversation has come up. So not everybody remembers, because not all of us were born back then, but in 1970, of course, the voting age was dropped from 21 to 18. Can you talk a little bit about why that happened and what were some of the arguments for and against then? I assume they've sort of repeated now.
They did. They did. And my understanding of that period of time was there were some similarities in that right now we have to grapple with the reality that we have a democracy with more old people in our democracy than young people. And back in that 50 plus years ago, there was concern and there was discussion about how to recover as a country, what was needed to increase the country's capacity economically, socially, and there were some very strong arguments made about the need to prepare 18 plus young people for taking on adulthood, and that would include the right to vote. Plus, many other countries had already done it. And so that really comes back to one of your earlier questions about, okay, we've talked about Austria, we've talked about Scotland, what about other countries? Well, we know that there are emerging movements in a number of other countries to do this, to expand voting rights. We know that more than 20 countries in the world have done it at some level or another. And that's one of the reasons why I keep going back to Austria, because they lowered the voting age to 16 at all elections at all levels within their country. So the research that we can rely on from there really tells us that there are benefits, and really there haven't been negatives identified.
So I want to sort of latch onto that in a two-part question. The first question is, when we're talking about 16 and 17-year-olds in Canada, how many people are we actually talking about would be eligible?
Roughly 2 million,
Okay.
and are almost gender balanced.
Okay. Now, the second part is, speaking of the Austrian experience, I find when it comes to electoral reform conversations, people get a little too hopeful sometimes, and they think it's a silver bullet that suddenly, like 100% of those people are going to participate and everything's going to change. We know that's probably not likely. These groups will probably vote at similar levels as other groups, but part of the
And
argument
higher.
is if you get to vote earlier, you are more likely to be a voter going forward. So do you think there would be an uptake in sort of civic engagement if we get this?
Well, I mean, the Austrian research tells us yes. And the Austrian research tells us that there's a high level of engagement among 16 and 17-year-olds. And what it also does is it opens up a sense of responsibility and engagement on that whole sector of our population that spills into work that is happening at the community level. It very often also, I shouldn't say very often, but we have some evidence in the research that older members of a family who weren't voting actually started to pay more attention and started to vote because the 16 and 17-year-olds in their family were determined to vote and very engaged.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you've done some work in your career on, intergenerational rights and how this sort of changes things. So, you were just talking about, I know this in my own family, like obviously I grew up in a pretty civically engaged family, so that was something I inherited. But giving people this ability, I have found, working in politics myself, my parents were always very interested in politics, but they became even more so because that was what I was doing with my life. So as young people get engaged, is there that ripple effect then for older generations who care about these young people?
I think we could have more research on this, but the research that I have seen where that question was explored, the answer to that is yes. There were again no negatives. No negatives. I mean, I say to my colleagues when this comes up, in Senate conversations, don't be afraid. There are no negatives here. It's okay. It's gonna help us as a country. It's gonna make us a stronger democracy.
How often do you get a policy change that has basically no downsides, right? Like almost never.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really, it's such a human trait to have something and want to hold on to it and not to share. It's such a human trait, and we see this all over the world. We've seen it forever. So I really do believe that it's when we can overcome that very emotional position of no, I don't want to share this right. No, I don't want to expand this right. No, I don't. And get beyond that and get people looking at what are the benefits and what are the facts.
So something I wanted to talk about, because you had brought up the Constitution earlier and how this doesn't require a constitutional change, but there's the flip side of it as well, which is that there can be constitutional challenges suggesting that, hey, our rights are not being honored here because it is being determined by our age, and that is discrimination. So there is a constitutional challenge out there right now, and I'm going to read this to make sure I get it right. It's supported by Justice for Children and Youth and the David Asper Center for Constitutional Rights. It's a number of young people are suing for their right to vote as young people under the Constitution. What do you think about this challenge? Where do you think it's going to go? Obviously, this kind of thing takes a while to work its way through, but do you think this will help with the cause?
Well, I should qualify my answer by pointing out that I'm one of the co-founders of one of the world's most successful strategic litigation organizations for rights, and that is the Legal and Education an action fund, LEAF Canada, which we founded in 1985. And what one can see about the legal system as a lawyer who's engaged with the legal system. I've been a lawyer for 50 years. So I've been around a while, and I've seen a lot of different ways in which our legal system gets used. This is a charter challenge, and Canada, to our credit, we'll see what happens with the Carney government, whether in fact the Charter Challenges program will continue to be funded. It was defunded when Stephen Harper became Prime Minister, and the reasoning at that time was colloquially, why would a government give money to people to sue the government? Well, that's a pretty simple, it's an understandable question. It's a very simplistic way to look at how we actually grow our capacity as a democracy. And one of the ways in which we do that is in Canada, is we have the independence of our judiciary, which is crucial, and we have the capacity that is increased for citizens to be able to challenge the charter, using the charter, and to really look closely at whether or not the promise of our Constitution is being delivered in the daily lives of people in this country. So I'm a strong supporter of the initiative by these young people, supported by very accomplished lawyers, by the way, who are working with them on this charter challenge based on the voting age staying at 18, and their arguments that the expansion of rights is something that to which they should be entitled. I think that similar to a bill, similar to what I'm doing in Parliament, the way in which we can further articulate exactly what we're talking about with voting rights, and the way in which we can better understand the application of our charter, of our Constitution, that's all to the good. That's part of a healthy democracy. Having our Constitution questioned and clarified is a very important part of the fact that we see our Constitution like a living tree.
So I think it's actually something interesting to bring up because, of course, we know that laws are not always moral and governments are not always right. And so it is important to have these accountability measures for citizens to actually make sure that they are getting what they deserve as citizens. I want to, before I get to my last question, I kind of want to talk about the moral implications of this process, because I think when most young people think about it, they think about how, an older person who maybe might not have that much time left gets to weigh in on policies that will last for the next 50 years. And they, as a younger person, don't get to do the same thing when they, God willing, hopefully get to live through, the next 50 years. I'm of the opinion that all of us should get to weigh on all these things because we were living, breathing citizens at this time. And I do think there is a bit of moral unfairness to have young people not be getting to weigh in on these decisions that very much are impacting their lives. We know we have climate change as an issue right now, and that's largely been dropped off the political agenda, I think, lately. There are a lot of economic conversations happening right now where you look at things like AI. I'm very concerned about young people, which is part of why this episode is part of the new season we're doing, which is going to be focused largely on young people. With AI, I'm very concerned that there won't be jobs for entire cohorts of young people going forward. So given, these major ethical and basically lifestyle issues coming up, why wouldn't we let young people vote, right? Like, do you have some thoughts on sort of the moral argument of that, of absolutely people should get to self-determine what their future looks like?
I do, but I would frame it not so much as a moral discussion. I would frame it as a question
That's the
of fairness.
philosophy. I was going to say that's the philosophy student in me.
Right, right. Well, yes, and I think you're raising ethics. You're raising and so of course the moral is also a way of describing that. But I think that there's a logic to this that's really important. That denying 16 and 17-year-olds the expansion of this right while demanding so much of them. I mean, I'll tell you one of the other aspects of talking to so many high school students, the number of high school students that are taxpayers in this country. This is something that needs to be understood.
Exactly.
The number
Exactly.
of young people who are in high school, who are 16 and 17, and who the research demonstrate they're fully capable of undertaking a reasonable vote, given information that's available. And as I've mentioned before, they're often much better informed than older voters. That the question of why would we not expand these rights is a question that there is no strong, rational, evidence-based answer to that question. There are lots of stereotypes, and there is the highly emotional, I have it and I don't want to share it. But to your point about the ethics of this, we are dumping so much on the generations following us, without giving them one of the most crucial aspects of having some voice, some way of responding to these burdens that are being passed on. And so I think sometimes in conversations when I'm able to engage my colleagues who say they're opposed, um, they I mean, I've actually had more than one of them just walk away because they don't have the ammunition to come back on this argument, and they're left with an intense emotional feeling of I don't want to share, and they walk away. I'm never going to get those votes, right?
No,
Um,
exactly. Yeah.
but I mentioned about 100 new members of parliament in the House of Commons. Well, we have over 20 new senators. This is the first time in a long time that the Senate of Canada has actually been full. And it's been the first time for a couple of years now that the Senate of Canada is gender balanced. Now, don't hear me for one moment saying that I think that women tend to
Right.
be more progressive than men. That is not what I've seen as a senator.
Yeah.
I have seen women invested in the patriarchy of the Senate, deeply invested, partly because they are so rewarded by playing that game and perpetuating that institution. So this really has to be an argument based on the evidence, looking at young people. And sometimes I say to my colleagues that are very strongly opposed, we're talking about 2 million votes in a country that is about 40 million people. So
Right.
what really is your risk analysis here? And it's hard to make that argument stick in a logical way.
Before I get to my last question, I'll give you one more piece of ammunition that came to me as we've been talking, which is if you give people the right to vote when they're 16 and learning about civics, as we move into this era of disinformation, there are countries around the world that are training their students to identify disinformation when they see it. I saw an older gentleman today who reposted something that was very clearly AI to me. He didn't know it was. But there is an opportunity while you're teaching people about the civic life that they're inheriting to also teach them about how to recognize some of these efforts to undermine that. And I can see no better thing than dumping 2 million very
Savvy.
voters, very savvy voters who understand some of these attempts to bring down our democracy. Like that, really, 2 million new informed voters would be great, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's a
perhaps,
really good point. Really good
right?
point. Yeah.
Perhaps we can find ways to get that kind of information to other voting groups as well. But I think if we are training folks from the start and allowing them to deploy that from the beginning when they first start voting, that's probably a great way to improve our democracy going forward.
Yeah, and I want to just make a last point about current legislation, and just to say that we haven't seen it roll out yet, but on the very last day that the Senate of Canada was sitting before we rose for the summer, Bill C5 was passed by a majority. I voted against Bill C5, just so you know. I was among a
Great.
small number of senators who voted against it, small number of senators who proposed amendments, all of which were defeated. Fine, that's, we work in a majoritarian system. However, the implications of this one piece of legislation for our democracy, the fact that voluntarily on both the House and the Senate side, parliamentarians actually gave up their parliamentary sovereignty through this bill, voluntarily gave it up, and that legislation that has taken decades to build, that is protective of our environment, of our physical and our social environment, can be completely ignored, and some of them were explicitly annihilated by this bill. And so what we're coming into is, I predict, a petrostate, because the list of so-called major projects is almost entirely on the oil and gas and extractive industry side, and very little on our green economy. And to foist this on the whole country, but this was voluntarily foisted by Parliament. So those folks, we will see how things roll out. But the nature of how the decision making in this country is currently operating has significantly changed, and has changed for a much more closed and much more geared to those who are already privileged in this country. And potentially the implications are massive. And so, to my way of thinking, and which brings us back to both the ethical side of this as well as the practical political side, when this kind of change occurs, that is a moving away from what has been an established practice of democracy in our parliament, this becomes a time when every citizen of this country, every voter in this country, is probably going to see what they didn't expect to see. And they're probably going to experience, not many of them, not the wonderful benefits that have been promised. And in that process, we will have become a corporatist petrostate.
Right.
And lots and lots of people disagree with me. And on this point, I hope I'm wrong.
Last question, because I always like to end on a positive note. For those who want to advocate for voting 16 and 17-year-olds, what can they do to help? Where can they go for more information? I leave the last words to you.
Thank you so much. Well, I really do highly recommend the national campaign website, Vote 16, vote16.ca or votesays.ca, because that is something that is maintained, is no longer maintained primarily by my office. It is maintained by a whole network of volunteers, but it also has sections where you can see the speeches that have been given in Parliament in relation to this. You can get the historical information. You can also see input from young people across this country. And one of the things that I don't think is well understood, and it's partly because it's happening at the provincial level, we have campaigns operating at the provincial and in some cases municipal level across this country. We have young people engaged in conversation with existing politicians at the municipal level, at the provincial level, at the national level, on expanding their rights to include 16 and 17-year-olds. This is something that has grown. It has grown in the 9 years that I've been proposing my bills, and it is something that is way bigger than any one piece of legislation, which at this point happens to be my bill S-222. So I think it's really important to bring together the citizen engagement side of this with the legislative engagement side of this. They complement each other, they need each other, and a lot of that is evident in the resource of vote16.ca. And I'm very happy to hear from folks as well. This is something that I'll never stop trying to do. And I have colleagues in the Senate who I know will pick it up when I leave the Senate. We just keep it in play. And at some point, I think we will find a time when, perhaps not even a time we expect, when it will tip and we will expand those rights and we will be a stronger democracy for it.
I cannot think of a better note to end on. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian communications company specializing in content creation, narrative development, and strategic communications. Our music was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.